The sound of shattering crystal cuts through the silence like a gunshot. 32 floors above Manhattan, in a penthouse worth more than most people see in 10 lifetimes, Nia Thompson stands perfectly still. Around her feet, fragments of a $1,000 vase catch the morning light, each piece reflecting like tiny mirrors of defiance. Dominic Rothwell towers over her, his face burning red with fury. $3.2 billion couldn't buy him the reaction he expected. His voice echoes off marble walls as he unleashes the same verbal assault that has broken dozens of employees before her. The same rage that sent 3 housekeepers running this week alone. But Nia doesn't move, doesn't shake, doesn't apologize. Down the hallway, faces peek around doorframes. The chef grips his spatula tighter. The security guard holds his breath. Even the elevator operator has stopped mid-floor, waiting for what always comes next. Tears, apologies, and another resignation. Instead, Nia looks this billionaire dead in the eye. Her voice cuts through his screaming with surgical precision. "Are you done throwing your tantrum, Mr. Rothwell? Because I have work to finish." The silence that follows could shatter glass. Before I tell you why this billionaire met his match, hit subscribe if you believe everyone deserves respect regardless of their job title. Don't be part of the problem. But let me take you back to how we got here. Because what you just witnessed, that moment of pure defiance, it started 6 hours earlier, when Nia Thompson stared at her phone screen showing a bank balance that made her stomach drop. $247. That's all that stood between her and eviction. Between her 8-year-old daughter Zoe sleeping in their 1-bedroom apartment or sleeping in their car. The marketing agency she'd built from nothing, the 12 employees who depended on her, the clients who trusted her vision, all gone when the world shut down overnight. Nia had conquered boardrooms. She'd pitched to Fortune 500 companies wearing power suits that cost more than most people's rent. Now she stood in line at an employment agency, clutching a resume that felt like a relic from another life. The receptionist barely looked up. Domestic position available. Rothwell penthouse. Immediate start. What happened to the last person? Nia asked. Same thing that happened to the one before that. The elevator ride to the 52nd floor felt like ascending to Judgment Day. The doorman, a kind-faced man named Robert, grabbed her arm as she passed. His whisper carried decades of witnessing heartbreak. 3 this week alone. The chef says he makes grown men cry just by walking into a room. The last housekeeper? 20-year veteran. She lasted 45 minutes. The elevator operator, Maria, shook her head sadly. He's not human, that one. Money turned his heart to ice. You seem nice, honey. Maybe this isn't for you. But Nia couldn't turn back. Not when Zoe's school shoes had holes that let in the rain. Not when their refrigerator held nothing but milk going sour and a box of generic cereal. Not when her daughter asked why they couldn't afford the art supplies for her school project, and Nia had to lie and say they'd get them next week. The penthouse doors opened to reveal a museum of wealth without warmth. Every surface gleamed with perfection that no one dared disturb. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen tears. Marble floors reflected nothing but emptiness. The walls displayed expensive art that felt cold as winter mornings. This wasn't a home. It was a monument to isolation. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the city where Nia once thrived. Where her agency's billboard used to smile down from Times Square. Where she used to matter. The irony cut deep, cleaning the windows that overlooked the empire she'd lost. She began her work with methodical precision, muscle memory from her corporate days kicking in. Organization was her superpower, whether it was marketing campaigns or household management. But when she entered his study, something shifted inside her. Chaos disguised as genius. Papers scattered across a desk worth more than her annual rent. Important documents mixed with coffee-stained napkins. 3 computer screens showing different projects, none making sense without proper structure. Her phone buzzed. Zoe's sweet voice filled the sterile air. "Mommy, can I get the colored pencils for art class tomorrow? Everyone else has the good ones." Nia's heart fractured. "Baby, Mommy's working on it. I promise we'll figure it out. It's okay if we can't. I can just use regular pencils." Mrs. Johnson says creativity matters more than fancy supplies. That's when something inside Nia snapped. Not with anger, but with determination. This job would work. It had to work. She wouldn't let her daughter go without while surrounded by obscene wealth. So she did what she'd always done. She organized. She created systems. She turned chaos into efficiency, because that's who she was, whether managing million-dollar campaigns or cleaning million-dollar messes. When Dominic Rothwell walked into his study that afternoon, expecting to find his controlled disorder exactly as he'd left it, he instead found something that would change everything. Order where there had been chaos. Logic where there had been madness. His important documents sorted by priority. His contracts filed by deadline. His scattered genius transformed into actionable intelligence. For a man who controlled everything through fear, finding someone who dared to improve his world without permission felt like a direct assault on his authority. That's when the crystal vase became a casualty of his rage. When his voice raised to levels that had broken stronger people. When he expected Nia to crumble like all the others. Instead, she stood there, steady as stone, and asked if he was done with his tantrum. If you've ever taken a job you felt overqualified for just to survive, this story is for you. Subscribe to support stories that matter to real people. Because what happens next will show you why sometimes the most desperate moments create the most powerful transformations. This story represents millions who face workplace intimidation daily. Your engagement helps their voices be heard. To understand why that moment shattered everything Dominic knew about power, you need to see him as he really was at 4:30 that morning. The alarm never had a chance to sound. Dominic Rothwell's internal clock was more precise than Swiss engineering, honed by 38 years of turning discipline into armor. Cold shower, black coffee, 90 minutes on the treadmill while reviewing quarterly projections. Every morning, the same ritual that kept the world at arm's length. His penthouse gym overlooked the city that bent to his will. Every building below represented a deal he'd crushed, a competitor he'd demolished, a fortune he'd claimed. From this height, people looked like ants. That's exactly how he preferred it. But the reflection staring back from those windows told a different story. 11-year-old Dominic stood in his mother's pristine living room, report card trembling in his small hands. Straight A's, except for 1 B+ in art class. "This is unacceptable." Eleanor Rothwell's voice could freeze summer rain. "B+? Do you think B+ builds empires? Do you think B+ earns respect?" Young Dominic's eyes filled with tears he dared not shed. "But Mom, I tried really hard on the painting project." Trying isn't succeeding. Emotions aren't achievements. If you can't handle simple academic excellence, how will you ever handle real responsibility? She took the report card and placed it face down on the mantel, next to his father's business awards. "You'll stay in your room until you understand that weakness has no place in this family." That night, Dominic burned his art supplies in the fireplace. If creativity meant disappointment, he'd choose calculation. If emotions meant failure, he'd choose coldness. If love required perfection, he'd become flawless through fear. By 14, he made his first $1 million in the stock market. His parents finally smiled. By 25, he'd built his first company. Their approval felt like sunlight after years of winter. By 30, he owned half of Manhattan's commercial real estate. Their pride became his drug of choice. But pride built on fear creates fear in others. Every employee who entered his presence received the same treatment his mother had perfected. The raised voice that made grown men flinch. The impossible standards that crushed confidence. The surgical precision of finding exactly what hurt most, then pressing until something broke. It worked every single time. The chef would stutter through menu presentations, sweat beading on his forehead as Dominic criticized every ingredient choice. The accountant would shuffle through reports with shaking hands, knowing one miscalculated decimal could trigger an hour-long verbal assault. The housekeeping staff lasted days, sometimes hours, before tears and apologies led to resignation letters. This morning started no differently. Dominic entered his study expecting the familiar satisfaction of absolute control. Instead, he found his world reorganized by someone who hadn't asked permission. His first reaction was pure muscle memory, the same explosive rage his mother had used to reshape his childhood. Voice raised to window-rattling levels. Posture designed to tower and intimidate. Words chosen like scalpels to cut exactly where confidence lived. But something unprecedented happened. Nia didn't break. She continued polishing the crystal paperweight in her hands, movements steady as a surgeon's. When his voice reached its peak volume, she looked up with eyes that held no fear, no apology, no submission. "Are you done throwing your tantrum, Mr. Rothwell? Because I have work to finish." The silence that followed felt like the world had stopped spinning. For 38 years, this approach had never failed. The volume, the presence, the psychological pressure. It was a perfect system for maintaining absolute authority. Grown executives had sobbed in these same marble halls. Fortune 500 CEOs had apologized profusely for imagined failures. Hardened business veterans had resigned rather than face another encounter. Yet this woman, this housekeeper who should have been grateful for employment, stood there like she was chairing a board meeting instead of cleaning his furniture. Dominic's mind raced through calculations that didn't add up. She should have crumbled by now. Should have offered tearful explanations and desperate promises. Should have begged for another chance like all the others. Instead, she resumed her work with professional calm that made his rage feel small and childish. Down the hallway, faces appeared in doorways like witnesses to a revolution. The chef's eyes went wide with disbelief. The security guard forgot his patrol route. Even the maintenance staff stopped their work to watch this impossible scene unfold. They'd all experienced Dominic's fury firsthand. They'd all seen colleagues reduced to tears and trauma. They'd all accepted that surviving in this environment meant accepting humiliation as the price of employment. But watching Nia treat his outburst like a minor interruption to her professional duties felt like watching gravity reverse itself. For the first time in decades, Dominic felt the ground shift beneath his feet. The system that had built his empire, the fear that had funded his fortune, the intimidation that had isolated his heart, none of it was working. And deep in a place he'd tried to wall off since childhood, something that felt dangerously close to curiosity began to grow. We all know someone who uses their power to hurt others. Don't let this behavior continue. Subscribe if you believe in standing up to workplace bullies. Because what Nia did next would prove that sometimes the most powerful response to a storm is simply refusing to bend. What happened next became the longest psychological chess match this penthouse had ever witnessed. Dominic retreated to his office, but defeat wasn't in his vocabulary. If raw intimidation couldn't break her, he'd try surgical precision. Every billionaire knew that persistence was just anger with better timing. The next morning, he inspected her work like a general reviewing troops destined for failure. The kitchen counters gleamed like mirrors, but he found a single water spot on the faucet. The living room furniture sat in perfect alignment, but one throw pillow was angled 2 degrees off-center. The bathroom marble shone like fresh snow, but he claimed the towels weren't folded to exact specifications. "This is unacceptable," he announced, his voice carrying the authority that had closed billion-dollar deals. "I expect perfection, not mediocrity." Nia looked up from organizing his book collection, her hands never pausing in their methodical work. "Mr. Rothwell, I'm here to maintain your home with excellence. If you're dissatisfied with my work, please specify exactly what needs correction. No defensiveness. No apologies. Just professional clarity that cut through his complaints like sunlight through smoke." From the kitchen doorway, the chef paused mid-chop. In 18 months of employment, he'd never heard anyone respond to Dominic's criticism with such calm precision. His knife hung suspended above the cutting board as he strained to hear what would happen next. Dominic's jaw tightened. The water spot on the kitchen faucet. The pillow angle in the living room. The towel fold inconsistency in the guest bathroom. "I'll address those items immediately," Nia replied, making notes on her phone with the same efficiency she'd once used to track million-dollar marketing campaigns. "Are there other specific areas requiring attention?" This wasn't how the script was supposed to play out. Employees were meant to stumble through excuses, promise to do better, maybe shed a tear or two. They weren't supposed to treat his feedback like actionable business intelligence. By lunch, he'd found 17 micro-infractions. A book spine not perfectly aligned. A window streak only visible from a certain angle. A carpet vacuum pattern that wasn't geometrically precise. Nia addressed each item with professional thoroughness, documenting his preferences in a system that would have impressed his executive assistants. No drama, no emotion, just problem-solving that made his complaints feel increasingly petty. The security guard found reasons to walk past the living room more frequently than his route required. The maintenance team lingered near doorways during their repairs. Even Robert the doorman made excuses to deliver packages personally, hoping to witness this historic standoff between a movable object and unstoppable force. They'd all lived in this atmosphere of controlled terror for months, some for years. They'd watched colleagues cry in supply closets and call in sick after particularly brutal encounters. They'd accepted that working here meant checking their dignity at the elevator doors. But watching Nia navigate Dominic's psychological warfare with professional grace felt like watching someone breathe underwater. Impossible, yet undeniably happening right before their eyes. By afternoon, Dominic had moved from nitpicking to manufactured outrage. He raised his voice about the temperature of his office, the arrangement of his desk supplies, the way she'd organized his filing system. Each complaint grew more unreasonable, his frustration feeding on itself as she remained unshakable. "This is completely unacceptable," he roared, his face flushed with the kind of anger that had sent Fortune 500 CEOs scrambling for apologies. "I don't pay for incompetence." Nia set down her cleaning supplies and looked directly at him, her voice steady as bedrock. "Mr. Rothwell, if my performance doesn't meet your standards, perhaps we should discuss specific expectations rather than general dissatisfaction. I'm here to solve problems, not create them." The silence stretched like a held breath. Dominic stared at this woman who refused to play by rules that had governed his world for decades. His usual tactics felt useless against someone who treated his fury like weather, unpleasant but temporary, requiring appropriate gear rather than emotional surrender. He turned and walked away, his Italian leather shoes clicking against marble in a rhythm that sounded suspiciously like retreat. That evening, Nia sat in her modest apartment, exhaustion finally claiming the composure she'd maintained all day. Her hands shook slightly as she heated leftover pasta for dinner. The armor she'd worn for 12 hours felt heavier than any business suit she'd ever worn. Her phone rang. Zoe's face filled the screen, art project supplies scattered on the table behind her. "Mommy, you look tired. Are you okay?" Nia's heart squeezed. This job, this daily battle of wills, this psychological warfare, it was all for this little girl who worried about her mother's well-being instead of focusing on her homework. "I'm okay, baby. Just learning how to work with someone very different from my old clients." "Is he mean to you?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Nia could lie, could protect her daughter from the truth about how some people treated others. Or she could model the lesson she hoped Zoe would never need, but probably would. Some people don't know how to be kind, sweetheart. But that doesn't mean we stop being professional. It doesn't mean we accept being treated badly. It means we stay strong and do our job with dignity. Like Wonder Woman? Exactly like Wonder Woman. The next morning, Nia returned to the penthouse with renewed purpose. Not just because she needed the paycheck, but because somewhere in that marble fortress was a battle worth fighting. Not for victory, but for the principle that respect wasn't something people earned through fear. Every view helps this message reach someone who needs to see that dignity is non-negotiable. Subscribe if you've ever felt powerless at work. Because what happened when Dominic realized traditional intimidation wouldn't work would change everything both of them thought they knew about power. 3 weeks into their psychological warfare, the fortress Dominic had built around his emotions finally cracked. It started with a phone call that should have been routine. The Henderson Group acquisition, a media empire worth $200 million that would crown his portfolio. 18 months of negotiations, countless late nights, everything riding on this final conference call with investors who held his company's future in their manicured hands. Dominic sat behind his mahogany desk, 3 monitors displaying financial projections that should have guaranteed victory. The numbers were perfect. The strategy was flawless. His legal team had covered every possible contingency. This deal would cement his reputation as untouchable in the business world. But as the call began, something felt wrong. "Gentlemen," the lead investor's voice crackled through the speakers with the warmth of a funeral director. "We've reviewed your proposal extensively, and frankly, we have concerns about your leadership methodology." Dominic's grip tightened on his Mont Blanc pen. "I'm not sure I understand. The financial projections speak for themselves." "Oh, the numbers are impressive. But we've heard troubling reports about your management style. High turnover rates. Hostile work environment claims. We can't partner with someone who creates liability through employee relations." The words hit like physical blows. Everything his mother had taught him about strength through intimidation, everything that had built his empire, was suddenly being weaponized against him. "Our sources indicate that you've had significant staffing issues. 3 housekeepers in 1 week? Multiple harassment complaints from former employees? This suggests a pattern of behavior that concerns our board." Dominic's chest tightened. His perfectly climate-controlled office suddenly felt suffocating. The air seemed thinner, like trying to breathe at high altitude. "We'll need to table this discussion until you can demonstrate improved workplace culture." "Good day, Mr. Rothwell." The line went dead. $200 million. Gone. Because of his reputation for breaking people who worked for him. His hands started shaking first. Then his breathing became shallow, rapid gasps that couldn't seem to fill his lungs. The perfectly organized office felt like it was closing in, walls pressing against his chest until he couldn't think, couldn't focus, couldn't control anything. This was how his world ended, not with boardroom victories or financial conquests, but with the simple truth that fear was a terrible foundation for building anything lasting. He stumbled to his private bathroom, loosening his tie with fingers that wouldn't stop trembling. The marble walls reflected his panic back at him from every angle, a broken man in an expensive suit, reduced to gasping like a drowning swimmer. The panic attacks had started after his father's funeral 2 years ago. Moments when the armor of control would slip, revealing the terrified child who'd never learned that love didn't require perfection. His mother's voice echoed in his head, "Weakness has no place in this family." But alone in this bathroom, weakness was all he had left. That's when he heard the soft knock. "Mr. Rothwell?" Nia's voice carried through the door, professional but concerned. "Is everything all right?" He couldn't answer, could barely breathe. The same woman he'd been tormenting for weeks was asking about his well-being, and the irony felt like another weight pressing against his chest. The door opened quietly. No dramatic entrance, no exploitation of his vulnerability. Just Nia stepping inside with the same calm presence she'd maintained through every one of his outbursts. She didn't ask questions, didn't demand explanations. She simply filled a crystal glass with cool water and set it on the marble counter within his reach. "Breathe in for 4 counts." Her voice was steady as a lighthouse beacon. "Hold for 4. Out for 6. Match my rhythm." She demonstrated, her own breathing deliberate and visible. Not talking at him, but breathing with him, creating a pattern his panic system could follow. This was the woman he'd screamed at over water spots. The employee he'd tried to break with impossible standards. The person he'd treated as less than human for weeks. And she was helping him breathe. 4 in. 4 hold. 6 out. Her hand didn't touch him, respecting his space while offering guidance. "You're okay. This feeling will pass." Slowly, impossibly, his breathing began to match hers. The crushing weight on his chest started to lift. The walls stopped closing in. When she spoke again, her voice carried understanding that came from experience, not textbooks. "Panic attacks feel like dying, but they can't actually hurt you. I learned that the hard way when my business collapsed. Lost everything overnight. Spent 3 months thinking I was having heart attacks every day." She'd been here too, in this same hell of financial ruin and psychological collapse. The successful woman he'd reduced to housework had walked through the same fire that was consuming him now. "The water will help. Small sips. Don't gulp." She stepped back, giving him privacy to recover without making him feel observed like a zoo animal. 5 minutes later, his breathing returned to normal. His hands stopped shaking. The businessman returned, leaving the broken child safely hidden where it belonged. Nia was already gone, returned to her duties as if nothing had happened. No leverage gained, no ammunition collected, no weakness exploited. Just human kindness offered without conditions or expectations. For the first time in weeks, Dominic looked at his reflection and saw something other than untouchable authority. He saw a man whose empire was built on the same fear that had just nearly suffocated him in his own bathroom. Later that afternoon, he found her in the library, organizing his collection of business biographies with the same systematic precision she applied to everything. She looked up briefly, made eye contact that held no judgment or pity, and returned to her work. Neither of them mentioned what had happened. But something fundamental had shifted in the carefully maintained distance between them. That evening, Dominic canceled 3 meetings and sent his assistant home early. He sat in his study, staring at quarterly reports that suddenly seemed less important than the realization that the woman he'd been trying to destroy had just saved him from drowning in his own fear. For 38 years, he believed that strength meant making others weak. That power required other people's pain. That success demanded sacrificing everyone else's dignity. But in his darkest moment, the person he'd treated worst had shown him what real strength looked like. Real strength isn't about power over others. It's about lifting people up when they're down. Subscribe if you believe in showing grace to those who need it most. Because what happened next would prove that sometimes the most powerful transformations begin with the simplest acts of unexpected kindness. 2 days later, everything changed because of a conference table and 12 leather chairs. The Yamamoto Corporation meeting was scheduled for Thursday afternoon. 3 Japanese executives flying in from Tokyo to discuss a joint venture worth $400 million. The kind of deal that required perfect presentation, flawless logistics, and zero room for cultural missteps. Dominic had hosted hundreds of these meetings. He knew the formula: impress them with luxury, overwhelm them with numbers, close them with confidence. His usual approach treated the penthouse like a showroom and meetings like performances. But when he emerged from his study that morning, he found something he'd never seen before. The conference room had been transformed into a strategic masterpiece. The table wasn't just clean, it was positioned to maximize natural light while avoiding glare on laptop screens. The chairs weren't just arranged in a circle, they were angled to create psychological equality while maintaining clear sight lines to the presentation screens. Even the temperature had been adjusted to account for the afternoon sun's trajectory across the floor-to-ceiling windows. Fresh flowers sat at precise intervals, not for decoration but for subtle fragrance that would keep everyone alert without being distracting. Bottled water was placed within easy reach of each seat, labels facing away to avoid corporate branding conflicts. The lighting was adjusted to complement the Japanese preference for slightly dimmer professional environments. This wasn't housekeeping. This was executive-level event management. Dominic found Nia in the kitchen, preparing refreshments with the same systematic precision. Not catered treats, but carefully selected items that aligned with Japanese business culture. Green tea alongside coffee. Light snacks that wouldn't interfere with conversation or create awkward eating moments during negotiations. Where did you learn to do this? The question came out before he could stop himself. Nia looked up from arranging traditional Japanese sweets she'd somehow acquired overnight. Learn to do what? The meeting setup. The cultural considerations. The strategy behind all of this. Her hands paused for just a moment, and something shifted in her expression. Not defensiveness, but the careful consideration of someone deciding how much truth to share. I used to run these kinds of meetings myself. As an assistant. A smile ghosted across her face, sad and proud at the same time. As the CEO. The words hung in the air like a challenge to everything Dominic thought he knew about the woman he'd been tormenting for a month. I built Thompson Marketing from my kitchen table 6 years ago. Started with freelance social media work for local restaurants, grew it into a full-service agency with 12 employees and clients across 3 states. She continued preparing the refreshments, her movements steady even as she revealed the life she'd lost. Our biggest client was a luxury hotel chain. We managed their entire digital presence, designed their loyalty programs, created campaigns that increased their bookings by 40% year over year. Dominic's mind raced through calculations. A marketing agency with those kinds of results would have been worth millions. The woman he'd reduced to cleaning his bathroom had once run a company that rivaled his own early ventures. What happened? March 2020 happened. Her voice carried the weight of every entrepreneur who'd watched their world collapse overnight. The hotel industry died in 2 weeks. Our biggest client couldn't pay their invoices. Then the restaurants closed. Then the retail stores. Within 30 days, I went from managing million-dollar campaigns to having no clients at all. She pulled out her phone, scrolling to a photo that made her smile despite the pain in her eyes. 12 people gathered around a conference table, wearing ugly Christmas sweaters and genuine happiness. Her team at their holiday party, back when the future felt secure. I kept everyone's salary going for 3 months, burning through my personal savings hoping things would turn around. Sold my car, then my apartment furniture, then my engagement ring. Kept believing we'd survive if I just worked harder, found more clients, made better deals. The photo showed a different Nia, polished, confident, surrounded by people who looked at her with respect and affection. The CEO who'd built something meaningful from nothing, just like he had. By June, I had to let everyone go. By August, I'd lost my apartment. By September, I was living with my daughter in my sister's spare room, taking whatever work I could find to keep food on the table. She set the phone aside and returned to her preparations, but Dominic was seeing her with completely different eyes. The calm professionalism he'd mistaken for servitude was actually executive competence applied to survival. The strategic thinking he'd dismissed as housekeeping was the same intelligence that had built and managed a successful company. The meeting setup you're seeing? I organized dozens of international business presentations. The cultural awareness? I had clients from 17 countries. The attention to detail? I learned that success lives in the margins where most people don't bother to look. Every interaction they'd had suddenly made sense. Her unshakable composure under pressure wasn't submission, it was leadership experience. Her systematic approach to problems wasn't compliance, it was strategic thinking. Her refusal to be intimidated wasn't stubbornness, it was the confidence of someone who'd once commanded boardrooms. "You've been treating this job like running a company," he said, understanding flooding through him. "Because that's what I know how to do. Whether it's managing marketing campaigns or managing a household, the principles are the same. Understand your objectives, optimize your systems, deliver consistent results." The irony cut deep. He'd been trying to break someone who had already been broken by forces far more powerful than his anger. He'd been attempting to intimidate someone who had faced the destruction of everything she'd built and chosen to rebuild rather than surrender. But more than that, he'd been dismissing someone whose experience and intelligence could have been invaluable to his own struggles, if he'd been wise enough to recognize it. The Yamamoto meeting that afternoon went flawlessly. The Japanese executives commented on the exceptional attention to cultural detail. The deal closed with terms more favorable than Dominic had dared hope. The success felt different somehow, knowing it had been achieved through collaboration rather than intimidation. That evening, he found Nia cleaning up the conference room with the same efficiency she'd shown in setting it up. "The meeting went well," he said. "I'm glad." She continued stacking chairs, no expectation of praise or recognition in her manner. "Your setup made the difference. Your understanding of what they needed." She nodded acknowledgement but didn't stop working. No fishing for compliments, no demand for credit. Just professional satisfaction in a job well done. For the first time in their month-long battle of wills, Dominic saw her clearly. Not as an employee to be managed or a problem to be solved, but as a fellow entrepreneur who'd faced the same pressures, fought the same battles, and survived the same failures that had shaped his own path. Never judge someone's worth by their current circumstances. Their story might surprise you. Subscribe if you believe in recognizing talent wherever it appears. Because what Dominic discovered about Nia would transform not just their relationship, but his entire understanding of what real leadership looks like. The transformation began with a single question that would have been unthinkable just weeks before. "I need your opinion on something." Nia looked up from folding laundry, surprised by the uncertainty in Dominic's voice. In 6 weeks of working for him, he'd never asked for her opinion on anything beyond cleaning schedules. He stood in the doorway holding a thick folder, his usual commanding presence replaced by something that looked almost vulnerable. The Meridian Resort acquisition. My team's been working on it for months, but we're missing something. The numbers work, but the market research feels incomplete. She set down the towels, recognizing the executive tone creeping back into his voice, not the billionaire giving orders, but one business leader consulting another. What kind of market are you targeting? Luxury hospitality. High-end vacation properties for affluent travelers. He hesitated, then added, "Would you mind taking a look? Fresh perspective might help." That afternoon, the dining table became a war room. Financial projections spread across polished mahogany, laptops displaying market analysis, notebooks filled with strategic calculations. For the first time since her agency collapsed, Nia felt the familiar rush of solving complex business puzzles. "Your research is targeting the top 5% of income earners," she said, studying the demographics charts. "But you're missing the aspirational market, people who save all year for one luxury experience. That's actually the fastest growing segment in hospitality." Dominic leaned forward, genuinely intrigued. "Explain." "Middle-class families who want to feel wealthy for a week. They'll pay premium prices for authentic luxury experiences, but they need different services than your typical ultra-high net worth clients. Childcare programs, flexible payment options, Instagram-worthy moments they can share to justify the expense." Her fingers flew across her laptop keyboard, pulling up research she'd compiled during her agency days. "Look at this data from pre-pandemic. The luxury market's biggest growth wasn't from people getting richer, it was from people willing to stretch their budgets for experiences that felt transformative. For 3 hours, they worked as equals. No employee-employer dynamic, no power struggles, just two business minds attacking a problem from different angles." Nia's understanding of consumer psychology filled gaps in his financial analysis. His industry connections provided context for her marketing insights. The breakthrough came when she suggested repositioning the entire acquisition strategy. Instead of another exclusive retreat for billionaires, they could create luxury experiences accessible to strivers, families who worked overtime to afford a taste of the life they dreamed about. "It's brilliant," Dominic admitted, reviewing their revised projections. "My team was so focused on exclusivity, we missed the larger opportunity completely." But the real transformation wasn't happening in spreadsheets and market analysis. It was happening in the hallways and kitchen corners where staff members exchanged amazed whispers. The chef noticed it first. He said, "Please," when he asked me to adjust the lunch timing. Actually said, "Please." In 18 months, I've never heard that word from his mouth. The security guard shook his head in disbelief. "Walked past me this morning and nodded. Not the usual pretending I don't exist. A real acknowledgement, like I'm actually human." Even Robert the doorman remarked on the change. "Held the elevator for Mrs. Patterson from the 15th floor yesterday. The old Dominic would have let those doors close and made her wait for the next one." The atmosphere in the penthouse shifted like seasons changing. Conversations replaced commands. Thank you became as common as good morning. Staff members stopped tiptoeing through their duties, no longer braced for explosive outbursts that might never come. But the most extraordinary transformation revealed itself on a Tuesday afternoon when Zoe visited for the first time. Nia had arranged for her daughter to come straight to work from school. Childcare had fallen through, and she couldn't afford to miss a day. She'd prepared Zoe with careful instructions about being quiet, staying out of the way, and not touching anything expensive. What she hadn't prepared for was Dominic's reaction when he found an 8-year-old girl sitting in his pristine living room, coloring in a workbook while eating apple slices. Instead of the explosion everyone expected, something remarkable happened. He stopped, stared for a moment, then slowly approached this small person who represented everything his world usually excluded: childhood innocence in a space designed for adult commerce. "You must be Zoe." The little girl looked up with eyes that held her mother's courage and her own natural curiosity. "Are you the mean man Mommy works for?" The staff froze. Even Nia held her breath, waiting for the reaction that would determine whether her daughter was welcome in this space or banished forever. But Dominic surprised everyone, especially himself. He knelt down to her eye level, this billionaire in his $1,000 suit, crouching on marble floors to talk to a child as an equal. "I used to be pretty mean," he said quietly. "But your mom is teaching me how to be better. What are you working on?" Zoe showed him her math homework, completely unintimidated by his reputation or wealth. "Multiplication tables. They're hard, but Mommy says hard things get easier if you practice." "Your mom is very smart." He studied the worksheet with genuine interest. "Would you like me to help? I'm pretty good with numbers." For the next 20 minutes, this man who had built an empire through intimidation sat cross-legged on his living room floor, patiently explaining multiplication strategies to a third grader. His voice held a gentleness no one knew existed, a warmth that emerged only when faced with complete innocence. Nia watched from the kitchen doorway, tears she didn't expect threatening to blur her vision. This was the man hidden beneath layers of corporate armor, someone who could still remember what it felt like to struggle with math homework, who could still connect with the vulnerability of childhood. When Zoe finished her work, she looked up at Dominic with the direct honesty only children possess. "You're not mean at all. You're just sad." The observation hit like a physical blow. This 8-year-old had seen through 38 years of carefully constructed defenses in 20 minutes of multiplication practice. "Maybe a little sad," he admitted, "but less sad than I used to be." That evening, as Nia packed up their work materials and prepared to take Zoe home, Dominic made an unexpected offer. "The conference room isn't being used tomorrow afternoon. If Zoe needs a quiet place to do homework after school, she's welcome here. The Wi-Fi is excellent for research projects." It wasn't just about childcare logistics. It was an invitation into his world for the people who mattered most to someone he'd learned to respect. Change is possible when people choose growth over ego. Subscribe if you believe in second chances and the power of human connection. Because what happened next would prove that the most profound transformations often begin with the simplest moments of genuine kindness. 6 weeks after that first shattered vase, Dominic made an offer that would have been impossible to imagine from the man who once screamed at housekeepers until they quit. "I have a proposition for you." Nia looked up from her laptop where she'd been refining their Meridian Resort strategy. The dining table had become their unofficial office, covered with business plans that bore both their insights. "The Henderson Group deal fell through because of my reputation," Dominic continued, his voice carrying a vulnerability she'd never heard before. "But working with you these past weeks has shown me something I'd forgotten. Success built on fear isn't sustainable. It's just expensive loneliness." He pulled out a leather portfolio, the kind used for major contract signings. "I want to start something different. A venture capital firm focused on ethical business practices. Companies that treat employees like humans, that create value without destroying lives, that measure success in more than just profit margins." Nia's heart stopped. This sounded like opportunity and terrifying risk wrapped in the same sentence. "I'm offering you a 50-50 partnership," he said quietly. "Equal stake, equal decision-making power, equal vision for what business can be when it's done right. The papers he spread across the table outlined terms that would have made her previous agency look like a lemonade stand. Capital investment in the millions. Resources she'd only dreamed of having access to. The kind of second chance that most failed entrepreneurs never received. But also the kind of risk that had destroyed her once before. Why? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Because you understand something I forgot somewhere along the way. That the people doing the work aren't obstacles to success, they are the success. Your marketing genius comes from actually caring about the humans behind the demographics. Your leadership strength comes from lifting others up instead of tearing them down. He paused, looking directly at her with honesty that cost him something to share. And because I've learned more about real business in 6 weeks with you than I did in 10 years of intimidating my way to the top. The offer hung between them like a bridge she wasn't sure she was brave enough to cross. That night, Nia sat in her small apartment, staring at the partnership agreement while Zoe did homework at their tiny kitchen table. The same table where she'd once built her first agency, back when the future felt limitless and failure seemed impossible. Her phone rang. Her sister's concerned voice filled the quiet apartment. Are you seriously considering this? Getting back into business with a man who made you cry in bathroom stalls? He's changed, Nia said, though the words felt fragile against her sister's skepticism. People don't change, Nia. They just find better ways to hide who they really are. What happens when the pressure gets high and he reverts back to the man who breaks people for sport? The questions felt like arrows hitting targets she'd been trying to ignore. What if this was just another elaborate power play? What if partnership was just a prettier word for exploitation? What if trusting someone who had initially treated her like dirt was the most expensive mistake she'd ever make? But then Zoe looked up from her math homework, pencil marks on her cheek and determination in her eyes. Mommy, remember when you told me that hard things get easier with practice? Maybe this is just hard, not wrong. Out of the mouths of 8-year-olds came wisdom that cut through weeks of adult anxiety. The next morning, Nia arrived at the penthouse to find something extraordinary waiting for her. The entire household staff had gathered in the living room, faces bright with excitement that seemed almost conspiratorial. The chef held a homemade cake. The security guard carried balloons. Even Robert the doorman had come upstairs with a card signed by everyone in the building. We heard about the partnership offer, the chef said, grinning wider than she'd seen in months. And we wanted you to know, you changed this place. You changed him. You made it possible for all of us to work with dignity instead of fear. The security guard nodded enthusiastically. My daughter was ready to drop out of college because I was too stressed from this job to help with tuition. Now I actually sleep at night knowing I won't get fired for breathing wrong. The housekeeper who'd been hired to replace one of Dominic's earlier casualties stepped forward shyly. I was so scared my first day. But everyone told me how you showed us that we didn't have to accept being treated badly. That professional respect wasn't something we had to earn through fear. The cake read, "Thank you for teaching us we matter," in careful blue frosting. Nia felt tears threatening as she realized what had happened. Her quiet refusal to accept degradation hadn't just changed her relationship with Dominic. It had transformed the entire atmosphere for everyone who worked here. Her boundary setting had given others permission to expect basic human decency. So, the chef asked with barely contained excitement, "Are you going to take the leap?" That afternoon, Nia signed the partnership agreement with hands that shook not from fear, but from anticipation. Dominic's signature joined hers on papers that represented more than business opportunity. They represented the possibility that people could actually change, that second chances could lead to first successes, that dignity and profit could coexist. Their first client meeting happened 3 weeks later. Angela Rodriguez sat across from them in their new office space, bouncing her 6-month-old son while explaining her business concept. Single mother, former restaurant manager, brilliant idea for a meal delivery service focused on cultural authenticity and fair wages for immigrant cooks. Most investors want huge returns immediately, Angela said, exhaustion and hope warring in her voice. But I need partners who understand that building something meaningful takes time and requires treating people right. Nia and Dominic exchanged glances that spoke volumes about shared understanding. They knew exactly what it felt like to need someone to believe in potential instead of just profit margins. "We're not most investors," Nia replied, pulling out a funding proposal they'd crafted together. "We believe in supporting businesses that prove success and social responsibility aren't mutually exclusive." 6 months later, their portfolio included 12 companies, all founded by people who'd been overlooked by traditional venture capital. Single parents, immigrants, formerly incarcerated entrepreneurs, disabled business owners, brilliant minds with revolutionary ideas who just needed someone to see their potential instead of their circumstances. The office walls displayed photos from their clients' grand openings. Angela's restaurant employed 30 people and had a 6-month waiting list. A formerly homeless veterans construction company specialized in affordable housing. A disabled software developer's accessibility app had been adopted by Fortune 500 companies. But the photo that mattered most sat on Nia's desk: Zoe, now 9 years old, presenting her science fair project about successful female entrepreneurs. Her research included her mother's story, but also stories of all the women their venture capital firm had supported. "My mom taught me that falling down isn't failing," Zoe had written in her project conclusion. "Staying down is failing. Getting back up and helping others get up too, that's winning." That evening, Dominic found Nia in their shared office, reviewing applications from potential clients who needed more than money. They needed someone to believe their dreams were worth the risk. "Any regrets?" he asked, settling into the chair that had become their unofficial end-of-day debriefing spot. Nia looked around their office, walls covered with success stories, desks scattered with business plans that would change lives, windows overlooking a city full of dreamers who just needed someone to take a chance on their potential. "Only one," she said with a smile. "That it took us so long to figure out that the best business strategy is actually just treating people like human beings." Their story proves that dignity, respect, and second chances can change everything. Subscribe to support more stories of people who refuse to give up. Because when we lift each other up instead of tearing each other down, everybody wins. 6 months after that partnership agreement was signed, the numbers told a story that even Dominic's old profit-obsessed mindset would have celebrated. 203 single parents had received funding through Dignity Dynamics. 147 businesses were not just surviving but thriving. The portfolio had generated returns that impressed even traditional Wall Street investors, proving that ethical practices and financial success weren't mutually exclusive. But the real transformation wasn't captured in quarterly reports or profit margins. The penthouse that had once felt like a marble mausoleum now buzzed with life every first Thursday of the month. Dinner parties that brought together program graduates, their children, and success stories that would have been impossible to imagine when Nia first walked through those doors. Angela Rodriguez arrived with her 1-year-old son and photos of her restaurant's expansion into 3 locations. Marcus Chen brought his teenage daughter, who was now interning at his sustainable packaging company. Jennifer Washington carried financial statements showing how her cleaning service employed 22 formerly homeless women, all of whom were now housed and earning living wages. These weren't networking events or business presentations. They were family dinners where children did homework while adults shared victories and struggles, where success was measured in lives changed rather than dollars accumulated. The dining table where Dominic had once eaten alone now required extensions to accommodate everyone. Conversations flowed in English and Spanish, punctuated by toddler giggles and teenager complaints about algebra. The sterile showcase had become a home that celebrated human connection over expensive isolation. Former staff members had returned, but not as employees. The chef now ran the catering division of their expanded operation. The security guard headed their facilities management company. Even Robert the doorman had launched a building services business that specialized in creating welcoming environments rather than intimidating barriers. They'd all learned something revolutionary, that businesses built on dignity and respect didn't just survive, they flourished in ways that fear-based organizations never could. But the most profound change lived in the small moments that no business plan could quantify. "Uncle Dom, can you help me with this math problem?" Zoe called from her spot at the kitchen counter, where she'd claimed permanent homework territory. At 9 years old, she moved through the penthouse like it was her natural habitat, art supplies scattered across surfaces that once displayed only expensive decoration. Dominic looked up from the laptop where he'd been reviewing grant applications with genuine enthusiasm that would have been unrecognizable to anyone who'd known him before. "What kind of problem are we solving tonight?" "Word problems about money," Zoe groaned dramatically. "Why is math always about money?" "Because money is how we keep score of whether we're helping people or just helping ourselves," he replied, settling beside her with the patience of someone who'd discovered that teaching a child was more rewarding than intimidating adults. Nia watched from the stove where she was preparing dinner for 3, a routine that had evolved naturally from business meetings that ran late to shared meals that felt like family. The college fund that Dominic had quietly established for Zoe sat in an account that would ensure her daughter never faced the financial desperation that had once driven Nia to clean penthouses. But more valuable than financial security was the relationship blooming between this unlikely uncle and the little girl who'd seen through his defenses in 20 minutes of multiplication tables. "Look at this one," Zoe pointed to her worksheet. "If Sarah has $500 to start a lemonade business, and she spends $200 on supplies, how much profit does she make if she sells everything for $800? What do you think?" Dominic asked, using the Socratic method he'd learned from watching Nia teach problem-solving skills. $600 profit. But that seems like a lot for lemonade. What if Sarah used that profit to help other kids start lemonade stands? What if she created jobs and shared success instead of keeping it all for herself? Zoe considered this seriously, her 9-year-old mind grappling with concepts that had taken Dominic 4 decades to understand. Then she'd be like you and Mommy, right? Making money by helping people make money. The simplicity of her understanding cut straight to the heart of everything they'd built together. 3 weeks later, they found themselves on a stage at the municipal center, accepting the mayor's award for social innovation. The auditorium filled with clients, staff members, and community leaders who'd witnessed the transformation that started with a shattered crystal vase and a woman who refused to accept degradation as the price of employment. This award recognizes businesses that prove capitalism and compassion can coexist, the mayor announced to applause that felt more like celebration than ceremony. Dignity Dynamics has created over 3,000 jobs while maintaining 0 employee complaints, a record unmatched in our city's history. Dominic and Nia stood together on stage, holding an award that validated everything they'd built. But as the photographers captured their moment of public recognition, both of them were thinking about what waited at home. The real victory wasn't the crystal trophy or the newspaper coverage or the validation from city officials. The real victory was what happened after the ceremony, when they returned to the penthouse that no longer felt like a monument to wealth but like a home built on mutual respect and genuine affection. Zoe sprawled across the living room floor, working on a social studies project about successful business partnerships. Her research included their story, but also stories of other unlikely collaborations that had changed communities and created opportunities where none had existed before. Did you know that some of the most successful companies started because people who were different decided to work together instead of fighting? She asked, looking up from her laptop with the kind of insight that made both adults realize she was going to change the world someday. Is that what happened with you too? She continued with the directness that only children possess. You stopped fighting and started building things together? Nia and Dominic exchanged glances across the kitchen island where they were preparing tomorrow's presentation for potential investors. The same space where she'd once cleaned around his anger was now where they collaborated on strategies to fund the next wave of dreamers who just needed someone to believe in their potential. Something like that, Nia replied, smiling at the understatement of the century. More like we learned that the best business strategy is treating people the way we want to be treated, Dominic added, reaching over to help Zoe with the graphs she was creating to illustrate economic impact. That night, as they cleaned up dinner dishes and organized tomorrow's schedule, the three of them moved around each other with the comfortable rhythm of family. Not the family any of them had planned, but the family they'd chosen to create through daily decisions to show up for each other. The award sat on a bookshelf next to Zoe's latest art project, a drawing of 3 stick figures standing in front of a building labeled, "Where Dreams Come True." Underneath, in careful 9-year-old handwriting, she'd written, "My family helps people start over when life gets hard." 2 years earlier, Dominic had been a billionaire who measured success in fear and controlled everything through intimidation. Nia had been a failed entrepreneur cleaning bathrooms to avoid eviction. Zoe had been a little girl who worried about her mother's tears and their empty refrigerator. Now they were living proof that the most profound transformations begin with the simplest decision to treat each other with dignity, even when circumstances suggest otherwise. Especially then. This transformation started with one person choosing dignity over fear. Your subscription supports stories that prove ordinary people can create extraordinary change. Be part of the movement. This story represents the power of human dignity and second chances. Every engagement helps these messages reach someone who needs to believe in their own transformation. Thank you for being part of positive change.